Hello and welcome. My name is Evgeny Rusakov and you're watching TVP World, interview from Vilnius. Since Donald Trump took the office in early 2025, there's been several separate meetings with Russian and Ukrainian officials on ending the war. As it became known late last week, the US side has prepared a peace plan that includes recognizing Russia's control over Crimea. To discuss negotiations, Crimea's issue and the situation in general, we are joined today by the political scientist from Vytautas Magnus University, Šarūnas Liekis. Šarūnas, glad to see you with us here today. Good day to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Šarūnas, first of all, what's your take? How do you assess these negotiations so far?
I mean, negotiations clearly, for those who are observing the whole process, are not easy. A lot of talks are happening behind closed doors. We know very little. We know only some leakages that are taking place, from time to time into media. And the questions is usually who is leaking all this.
How do you then assess what should we believe in then, and what should we say like, no, this is definitely not happening?
For sure, I mean, the talks are between Russians and Americans, and talks are about strategy. I think about the strategic interaction between Russian Federation and the United States. And I would say Ukrainian issue is one of the issues. This is my guess. This is one of the issues. Probably this is the most visible and the most most discussed issue in the last years. But overall, this is one of the elements for sure. I mean, this is about, geostrategic...
geostrategic and future of our world.
Future of the world and geostrategic balance between the major powers, because not depending on what we think about this, I mean, the world is moving away from US hegemony into multilateral formats. I mean, how these multilateral formats will look, we'll know probably like in 10 or 15 years, most probably. This is a long process of the whole system to change. So the system is changing relatively slow, and the changes should be acceptable to all major powers and players. I mean, if there is no consent, it's very difficult, to keep the system in balance.
Okay, let's move on. So, again, back to that negotiations thing. The head of State Department, Marco Rubio, said that this week will be critical for Russia-Ukraine peace talks. And so how do you assess this statement? Because there's been some similar statements before. And could you, say, withdraw from these talks if they do not get the desired result? And what is probably most important here, is success in such negotiations possible without the United States?
Probably United States are playing important role, critical role, by making the very subject of negotiations and peace available to the world audience. Because before that, we will remember that what kind of discursively, the main politicians in the world were discussing the peace or war issues. The previous administration, Biden's administration, was very militant in terms of the posturing towards the Russian Federation, and there was no talk about even possible peace. So everybody who was pro-peace was accused of being basically pro-Putin. And suddenly you get, Trump, who jumps in with peace proposals, and suddenly his ideas are being accepted, and then everybody is complaining why Russians are not agreeing to Trump's proposals, basically, though we don't know Trump's proposals. This is an issue as well. So I think the situation is rather difficult, and it reflects US ambivalence towards Europe generally, because most probably they are not sure that they have certain interests in overall, the new administration, that there is an interest for them in Europe. When they are speaking about pivot to Asia, United States, and they started already at the end of the 90s to discuss. I remember from my studies at the university in the United States, where then everybody was saying already that we don't have real interest and we don't want to invest much more into European security, etc., etc. So there was this trend. I'm not saying that this was dominant it was changing with different administrations, but this trend was already visible at the end of the 90s, I would say. And therefore, the whole discussions about the fact that United States might retreat from the kind of pivot to Europe, from the key position in Europe, might take place because they seem to be overextended. The whole, let's say,
overextended around the world.
I mean, they are committed to. If you take and you look at the bilateral agreements between the United States and the other countries, I mean, not talking about NATO format, etc.
Exactly, yes, bilateral.
Yeah, bilateral, they have agreements with around 110 countries. And so the agreements with these countries are very different. The level of commitment is also differs from country to country. And the scope of the problems is rising. U.S. debt is rising. Economy is not performing so well. The issues in social affairs are visible for everybody who visits the United States, casually or as a tourist. And so the issue is that basically, and the threat from the U.S. administration is that they might drop negotiations between Russia and Ukraine altogether, the whole topic and the whole conflict. And we are hearing, that right now in India and Pakistan something is happening, still many issues unresolved in East Asia. And so why to be committed? Though let's say the countries in East Central Europe, especially, they feel vulnerable and they are looking for some kind of protector. But this is kind of visual thinking. Very often, I mean, it's like we don't know to what extent it might, the provisions and the help might work in the case of East Central Europe.
Let's move on. Crimea's issue. How big is it in the peace talks? What do you think?
I think it has symbolic importance. De facto, Ukraine is not
for
in
Russia,
control. For Ukraine, for Russia, and for many other countries. I think this is the question of rule of law in international relations. I mean, to what extent international law is determining, let's say, the borders. To what extent the borders are invincible and untouchable. I mean, for the main participants in the international affairs.
Do you think Trump is right by saying that the issue of Crimea should have been solved like in 2014 and now it's just too late?
I think probably he's not right because there's still the process and the conflict was still evolving between Ukraine and Russia in 2014. What actually happened after Maidan and the relation, still the strategic balance was unclear for both sides. The Russians were still also exploring what is going on, and the Ukrainian side was not convinced that they lost Crimea forever at that moment. But Trump is right from one point of view that basically, if you look at his, let's say, his CV of behavior, I mean, the way he was behaving, in the past. For example, if you look at the Golan Heights, Trump actually, despite the fact that all the world does not recognize Golan Heights belonging to Israel, or the question of Jerusalem, actually, he de jure had recognized Golan Heights and Jerusalem as part of the state of Israel. And I didn't hear anybody, complaining about that, though, this was in principle a severe violation of the status quo in terms of international law around the world. And we forget also Kosovo, the way Kosovo question had been, dealt with and solved. And it's, for many countries, including Ukraine for many, many years did not recognize Kosovo precedent. Generally, did not recognize Kosovo. So this is these are issues complicated, and if to delve further down into history, we have to remember that all these borders, what we have in East Central Europe, they had been drawn by the winners of the Second World War in '45, and so the borders, if the main winners suddenly decide, to redraw the borders, what can you do? I mean, the main players in international system, those who basically determine the nature of international system. So it might be complication, despite our willingness or unwillingness to face the fact might be very unpleasant for many observers.
Unfortunately, you're right. I have to ask about other territories, such as Donetsk region, Lugansk region, Kherson, and the rest. What about them? How do you assess? Should they, de facto, they are under Russia's control, but how should this end?
I mean, the problem is that, once again, I mean, if those who are in control of the territory, if they claim that this territory is theirs, I mean, if there is nobody who is willing to fight back for these territories, for example, we remember the case of Iraq and Kuwait. I mean, all international community was ready to fight for Kuwait and to liberate Kuwait. But if they were not determined to do that, at that point of view, probably we would have right now like one of the Iraqi provinces, called probably Kuwait or something else, El Kuwait or whatever. Right. So we would have the situation. So it's a question of is somebody willing to do, in real terms, to change status quo.
Not just saying, but doing
not just talking. And the claims, let's say, at the rhetorical level, at the political level, are important for the claimants for the territory. This is very difficult to predict in practical terms, what will happen in 20, 30, or 15 years. But at present, we know that, if you don't have real force and real power, to change status quo.
Looks like you cannot change a lot.
Yeah, so you cannot change much unless you negotiate and then you bargain and you exchange your, let's say, one territory for something, or for change of your status, for example. You recognize that you say that.
Okay. Then there's another question. Then what should Europe do if Crimea is de jure recognized by the United States as Russia's territory?
De jure recognition is it's kind of subjective issue of what we think is right or is not right. So every country has a right to say no, though United States, for example, do this or that. For example, I gave this example about Jerusalem, for example.
That's right.
Majority of the countries don't recognize Jerusalem as the state, as the capital of the state of Israel. And this is the fact, but United States do that. I mean, because this is a kind of one of the major powers in international relations. For a long time, this was a hegemon, so everybody would follow them, as a rule. And most probably there will be countries that would recognize, Crimea as a Russian territory.
Oh, I think that would be Belarus for sure. North Korea, for example.
So we'll get some islands, as well. Maybe we don't know. So probably, you'll start getting more and more of countries like that. But usually everybody thinks about the consequences for their own territory and for their own well-being and territorial integrity.
Are we opening? Will U.S. open the box of Pandora by saying that Crimea now belongs to Russia?
I think the Pandora box had been opened long before.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think the main issue, though there are many debates about how it's different and how it's similar to the case of Crimea, but for example Kosovo. I think one of the main issues is Kosovo issues, which opened in Europe at least Pandora box. In this case, for the Europeans, I think Kosovo and Crimea are kind of two main
issues
problems which raises a lot of questions for the future and the way the system of international relations will function.
Let's hope this future will be bright for us. Šarūnas, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your insight, and really hope to see you once again here in our TVP World studio.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation.
And I would like to remind our viewers that our guest for today was a political scientist from Vytautas Magnus University, Šarūnas Liekis. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us.